In his book, Winning the Right Game, Ron Adner starts by quoting Mark Twain, who said, "What gets us into trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so." And what we don't know these days is what's happening in the business world. The shifts underway supersede the impact of COVID. Adner says the old rules don't apply any longer. So it's time to shift gears because, as he puts it, winning the wrong game means losing. Take Kodak, for example, a company that foresaw the shift to digital and succeeded in transitioning to digital everything, and they still failed. Not because the company was unwilling to adapt and change, but because it changed to the wrong format. Kodak scored big with digital cameras and digital printing, but it completely missed digital viewing, even though the company was light years ahead in cloud computing and storage. Adner says the Kodak story is compelling because it provides a perfect illustration of where, how, and why classic strategy breaks down in the face of ecosystem disruption. I invited Ron Adner to join me for a conversation that matters about why ecosystem shifts trump technology, COVID, and classic business strategies. Mr. Adner, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You know, when I first came across the idea of an ecosystem shift, I went, what is that? Like, at first I didn't understand it. I mean, you really have to read the book, then you start to go, aha, the light bulb comes on. But what does an ecosystem consist of?
It's a great question, right? So ecosystem today is as buzzy a business word as there is. But if you listen carefully, most of the time when it's evoked, you can take out that word ecosystem, you can put in the word mishmash, and the sentence will probably not lose a lot of meaning. And what that signals to us is that people are really concerned with mishmash, with new connections and interdependence. But the fact that we can use the word mishmash as a synonym says we're missing a lot of structure behind it. So when I talk about the idea of an ecosystem, there's something very specific in mind, which is the structure of collaboration between partners in delivering a value proposition. And an ecosystem shift is what happens when that structure changes. And that's going to lead to a very different kind of dynamic, a very different set of challenges and opportunities than the way we usually think about shifts and technology changes in the business world.
Okay, let's take the Kodak example, because you do such a great job of outlining it in your book. What ecosystem shifted that they missed, even though they were fully aware that digital was coming? Didn't they invent the digital camera, I think, in 1975? Like, they knew it was coming, and still they couldn't see the change that was going to take them down.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought up that case study, because Kodak is, it's the most overtold, but in some ways the most misunderstood and mistold story in the modern business lexicon. The classic story that we tell about Kodak is they invented the digital camera in the 1970s, and then they fumbled their way through digital because they were an analog company tied to making their money through film and developers and photo papers. And so they let the rest of the world pass it by, and Sony and Nikon and Hewlett-Packard win in cameras and printers, and that's why they disappeared. And it turns out that story is entirely wrong. And the lessons drawn from that story then become dangerously wrong.
Right.
The real story, I mean, so it's not that Kodak doesn't go bankrupt, and it's not that Kodak doesn't have a hard time adapting to digital. It's that in 2000, they actually get their act together. New leadership comes in, and Kodak commits to being a digital company. And where they see the money is they look over at HP making all this money in inks and papers and digital printing, and they say, we are going to become a digital printing company just like that. And they go on a 10-year journey during which they become the #1 seller of digital cameras in America. They become a really formidable rival in printer sales. If you've ever been to a Walmart or a CVS, even today, you will see those yellow boxes, the kiosks where you print digital pictures. That yellow is Kodak yellow. Kodak became an incredibly powerful digital printing company, but then was undone by the fact that digital printing itself was made largely irrelevant by digital viewing, right? So the game that they were going after was, can we become a digital printing company rather than an analog printing company? And the ecosystem disruption was when printing itself gets disrupted by digital viewing.
Okay, so how does a company then like Kodak, because later on in the chapter you point out they even came up with the digital frame that you could view with a much higher quality digital viewer, like on that frame, put it on your bookshelf. But that wasn't where the consumer was going. And so how important then is it that they had to pay attention to what the consumer wanted and what that payoff for the consumer was going to be? And somehow they missed it, and yet all the pieces seemed to be there for them to be able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and this is in some ways the key to this whole perspective that says when we look at change, we have to look not just at what's happening with the technology, right? Chemical versus digital. Not just what it is that consumers are doing, but what's the full package of activities, the full set of value elements that come together to deliver the value proposition that the customer wants, right? And essentially what undid Kodak was that the story was one of digital screens, which initially were a complement, were a positive thing, or something used alongside a printer. Digital screens transforming from being a complement to being a substitute to the paper print. And this kind of dynamic where an element that in the beginning is helpful and in the end is undermining your ability to create your value, what I call a value inversion, this is the hallmark of what I term ecosystem disruption, where the disruption is not just about one technology, a new technology doing your job, it's about a new element changing the relevance of what it is that you're doing.
So, as I say, I was fascinated by the book. I'm reading, okay, here's Kodak. They're already into cloud storage light years ahead of everybody else. And yet,
right, they bought photo in 2000.
Yeah, but they weren't in the smartphone technology business, and they didn't really see what Steve Jobs was doing and how that was going to change things. And then there was social media that became another digital viewing platform. What could Kodak have done to be able to try and realign itself with some of those shifts? And how would having an ecosystem shift mindset help them to have been positioned in a better place?
Yeah, that's such an important question, right? And the heart of this book, Winning the Right Game, is about how do you first understand the real game being played? And if we look at what Kodak did in its digital transformation, it's not that they shouldn't have tried printing, right? I don't think that's a fair critique. But had they seen the complete value architecture, right, kind of the part of the toolkit that's presented in this book, there would have been a much more compelling argument to be made about why they shouldn't bet at all on printing, right? So it turns out Kodak actually had a very strong position in the sensor market because of their history of technology in photo developing equipment. They were in a great position to further invest and look, today Sony makes a huge amount of profit from their digital sensors, photo sensors. That could have been Kodak. So there are all kinds of additional plays, hedges that they could have made had they seen that the game was not just about putting ink on paper in a new way.
So what was the difference then? Yeah. So what was the difference then between what Kodak did and what a company like Lexmark did?
So this is a great comparison, right? So usually we think about Kodak in their Fuji, right? Fuji being another kind of classic chemical company, and Fuji basically decided we're not going to play this digital game, and they focused on their core competencies in production. Good for them. The more interesting story was Lexmark, right? So Lexmark was a company that was built for digital printing, and they were facing the same disruption of screen substituting paper. And as I discuss and show in the book, they were quite prescient in that they saw the same patterns that Kodak was living through in the late 2000s, and decided to, knowing that you can't fight this transition, that they were going to accommodate it. And they transitioned themselves from being a printing company to being a document management company, right? So they created this adjacency to help their existing customers with these tasks that would remain even when paper became less relevant. And they end up doubling their value at the same time that Kodak goes to zero, which is a great demonstration that if you look and you know how to look, you can see things and then do things.
Okay, well then that raises the question, how do you look? How do you happen to see those disruptive changes that are coming to the ecosystem, not just the technology?
Yeah, so I think that's the $1 million question that actually has a set of answers, right? And this book was a 10-year journey to figure out what's a systematic approach to giving a credible answer to that question. And where it starts is, just as you said, needing to step back from a technology focus and really think about how it is that value is being constructed, right? So I introduced this concept of a value architecture, that if you go step by step and deconstruct your offer, you can use this as a lens to see where disruption can come from. And then that gives rise to all kinds of questions, right? Like, not just is disruption coming, but how do I think about the timing of disruption, right? How do I make sure I'm not too late, but also you don't want to be too early? How do I respond to this disruption, right? Sometimes it's about giving up and finding a new location. Sometimes it's, no, you can actually defend, right? I mean, the Kodak story is, I start the book with the Kodak story. In some ways, it's the easiest story because no one was going after Kodak, right? Steve Jobs didn't invent the iPhone to take down Kodak. Many people in business today, though, are facing active ecosystem disruption. If Amazon is moving into your market, Amazon is trying to eat your lunch. These giant tech companies that we're all worried about, they make their moves. And so responding to them is possible, right? If you know how to respond, right? That's why I talk about these kind of really interesting stories of companies like Spotify and Wayfair and TomTom facing off and succeeding against Apple and Amazon and Google. But it requires a different approach to strategy, this kind of ecosystem-based approach, which means we have to think beyond traditional industry structure.
So what are the first things that you need to be aware of to make sure that you are now becoming, what was that quote that you used from the one guy? He said, to be paranoid means to survive, or something along those lines. Like in business, like I'm always worried, am I staying far enough down the track? But I have to admit, I'm looking at your book and I'm going, okay, I don't even know what to be looking for on the horizon. So what's the first step?
Well, so the quote is from Andy Grove, legendary CEO of Intel. Only the paranoid survive, and it's interesting because it's a quote from 1996. He wrote a great book in 1996, and 1996 was an era where the imperative was to wake up leadership to say, hey, your world is changing. It's 2020. Everyone is paranoid, right? No one is asleep, right? If anything, people are being irrational because they're not getting enough sleep, because everything looks worried. And so again, the starting point here is to say, all right, let me understand how I create my value. Not just me through my own execution, but the ecosystem that I have assembled to put together this offer. And from there, we can start asking questions about every change that I'm seeing or every change I'm considering as an opportunity. How does it impact not just me and my capabilities, but the way I work with and align with these partners? And through this, we can reveal what's more likely, what's less likely, and what kind of investments and actions are going to be more impactful versus the ones that the companies lose a ton of money by misinvesting in this ecosystem context. And that's small as well as giant companies. It all comes down to the way in which your value proposition is constructed by you in collaboration with your critical partners. That's what an ecosystem is.
So those critical partners keep changing, though. You know, I can't help but think in news, if we take a look at the Chicago Tribune, this once powerful newspaper, in essence, gone. The New York Times kept shifting and changing, and rather than necessarily taking a look at Google and Facebook and so many of these others as being horrible competitors, they said, well, we'll partner with you. And they allow these companies to piggyback off of their network of people and make them all interconnected. Is this the kind of like mindset shifts that we have to say, you're not necessarily my competitor, but we can work together to continue to deliver the experience that your customers and our customers jointly seek?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right? And part of what it requires then is not just understanding who your partners might be, but what your roles in that partnership are, how they might shift and how they might shift over time. Right, this notion of value inversion, I mean, keep in mind, when Facebook first started, newspapers thought they were great because they were getting ad revenue. And then the discovery was now they've totally commoditized us and they're terrible. Right? I think players like the Times, the Wall Street Journals were much more savvy about how they wanted to interact with the Googles, the Facebooks of the world. And it's not because they were going to be able to keep them out of the business. It was about finding a defensible strategy through which they could coexist. Right? And this is, in some ways, chapter 3 of the book is about ecosystem defense. And the key to understanding ecosystem defense is that it's a strategy that leads not to the evisceration of your rival, but to a productive coexistence.
Right. Because I live in a small business world, I have a small business. I keep thinking, how do I apply that? And you were talking about, you look at Uber Eats or something and what its relationship now is to restaurants. Restaurants that may have been dominant players no longer have an advantage over the little mom and pop shop that was just beyond sort of a neighborhood that would attract customers. Who wins in that kind of disruption? Is it the big guys? Is it the little guys? Does everybody have to be looking at how do we integrate?
Well, I think if you're not looking at how you integrate, the risk is you're just going to wake up one day and the world will have changed around you. And that's basically the restaurant story. Look, small restaurants were never in a position to beat Uber Eats. But that's different from saying they had no possible influence on that game, right? So it's really important when we talk about ecosystems, we tend to celebrate the ecosystem leaders, right? The giant companies that dominate. But what we forget is that the way you get to be a leader is that followers choose to follow you. And in chapter 5, the ecosystem chapter, right? There's a long discussion about, well, so what are strategies for smart followerships? If you realize that you can't lead, you still have an enormous amount of power in helping select who the leader is. And smart followers know that their power is early in the game, where there are multiple leadership candidates, and the one you back is the one that you can create better governance terms with, the ones whose long-term success is more aligned with your own long-term success, rather than just ceding the ecosystem formation to the guys who show up and yell the loudest and throw the most short-term dollars around, because we know that flow stops after a while.
You just mentioned ecosystems. Somebody's going to say, hang on a second, I thought we were talking about ecosystems. What's the difference between an ecosystem and an ego system?
Well, this is, so I draw this distinction, right? It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but an ecosystem is how you think about an ecosystem when you define your world around yourself, right? So as we said earlier, kind of when I talk about ecosystems, the anchor is the value proposition that you're trying to create. And that lets you know what you're doing and who you're doing it with. An ecosystem approach, which by the way, I think is how most people think about ecosystems, is when you anchor the discussion around a company. So when people talk about the Apple ecosystem or the Google ecosystem, that is an ecosystem trap. Because it turns out that Apple trying to do something in health, it's a very different set of partnerships and a very different structure than Apple trying to do something in mobile payments. And in fact, I would say many of these giant ecosystem companies have been underwhelming in their ability to shift to new ecosystems, precisely because they succumb to this trap of an ecosystem where they think that just because they're involved, everything is going to keep orbiting around them, rather than recognizing they need to regain the right to lead in these new ecosystems.
Well, and they hype it up too. And how is it that we, as other players that don't have that kind of scale, how do we, sift out that hype and tell the difference between what are legitimate changes and the ones that are really going to stick?
Right. So that, again, it's a great question, right? Because it works on two levels. There's the question of who do you follow, but you also have the question of, well, so what do you think is going to be real and what is not, and when, right? So like self-driving cars, if you were betting on self-driving cars 10 years ago, your prize in 2021 is relatively limited. We know it's coming, but if you get the timing right, being too early doesn't help, right? Electric vehicles, right? That's the poster child. You got to remember, GM introduced the world's first electric car in the mid-90s, the EV1. The prize they get, zero today, right? They're starting basically from scratch again. And so when we're thinking about where to bet, it's what's the context, who's trying to lead, but also when is it that they're going to be able to bring these pieces together, right? And so here, what it means is being able to listen and analyze the implications of the promises they're making beyond themselves. What's their ability to align these other adopters to drive co-innovation rather than just their claim on, we're going to have our piece ready in 2023, so that means everybody should be ready to jump in the pool next year.
Yeah. Only got a couple seconds left here, Ron, but I want you to promote where people can get the book. And I know that you've made the first chapter available for reading for free. So where can people find that?
Oh, well, so, they can find the book everywhere, but if they go to my website, ronadner.com, the first chapter is posted, the Kodak chapter, and I invite everybody to read it, to share it. The goal with this book is to just help people be more effective as they're facing an increasingly complex world. And so, it was just a delight to get to discuss these ideas with you, and hopefully it'll be of help to folks.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. I couldn't stop reading it, and I've been sharing it with everybody, and their eyes go like this, especially when I start telling them about the myths of Kodak. And this is why it's important that we keep our eyes wide open and be aware of changes that are beyond what's right in front of us. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much.